Hey, I want to welcome everyone. I'm Stephen Procopio. I'm the president of the Public Affairs Research Council of Louisiana. We're a nonpartisan independent watchdog and policy research group. Today, as part of our monthly webinars, this seems like it's an annual event. We're having our webinar about the constitutional amendments on both the November and December ballots. So we're going to all do it as one. Since 1974, there have been 316 proposed amendments. And you add the ones we have now, we're going to go to 321, of which 216 have passed so far. To talk about that, we've gathered a spectacular panel. If we had a regular group of panelists, it would definitely be this group. We have Barry Erwin, president of the Council for a Better Louisiana, better known as CABLE. Very much think of ourselves as sister organizations. One difference is CABLE does take position on the amendments, but PAR does not. We have Jan Moller, executive director of Invest in Louisiana. Made sure I didn't use my old notes and use Budget Project. And your focus is on public policy, but with a particular focus on low and moderate income groups. And we also have Daniel Erspamer, whose focus is on the benefits of individual liberty and free enterprise. And if I left out anything of your organizations, feel free to chime in if I left out a particular emphasis. For the format, for everyone that's joining, for each amendment, I will give a very brief focus and summarized statement. There's a lot more to these things. We're going to leave out some details. If you want the details, you can find our amendment guide. You can read about it all there. And it does pain me. These are in some cases, very detailed amendments. And it was tough on all of us as we had to go through it to try and digest it for the public. And then Melinda will make a few comments, and then we'll open it up for conversation with the panelists. Questions. The best part about this webinar is that we can take questions from y'all. So please, if you reach out to the Q&A, just put your questions in there. We'll try to get it in order, try to get it earlier if possible. We tend to run out of time. We're going to try and probably take them by groups, but we will skip around in the second half. And just to let everyone know, this will end up being on our YouTube channel, so you can share it with other people later when it happens. So why don't we get started? Alex, can you pull up the first? All righty. So there's only one amendment on the November 5th election. It is about essentially, we have already currently the revenue from mineral revenue from the Gulf is shared with the state. And that mineral revenue is dedicated to the Coastal Protection and Restoration Fund. And that can only be used for coastal projects that are consistent with the master plan. This amendment would essentially extend that to alternative energy. For the most part, that's going to mean wind farms. Now, two things have to happen. You actually have to have wind farms, and then the federal government would have to agree to share that money with us. But if those two things happen, then this money would go into the coastal fund to be used for coastal projects. With that, Melinda?
Thank you. As Stephen said, there is actually no funding yet that the federal government has agreed to give us for this, but this would dedicate future funding if the bills that are pending in Congress pass to dedicate that money. So I'm going to start with, we have a couple positions from the various organizations represented. So I'm going to start with Barry Erwin with CABLE, because CABLE has taken a position in support of this amendment. So Barry, can you tell us a little bit about why you are supporting this?
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty consistent with what we've done in the past. As you recall, many years ago, in fact, really prior to Katrina, we were trying to get money from the federal government for, revenues, severance, and royalties, all that from the Outer Continental Shelf. We weren't getting any, and our congressional delegation was working hard to get that. Katrina came, and a lot of things happened. We passed a constitutional amendment back in 2006 that basically said, if we get any oil and gas revenues from outside, our state waters, Outer Continental Shelf, we want to say we're going to dedicate that to the coast, to protection and restoration. And it's served us very well by doing that. It's probably led to the fact that we've gotten that money for sure. And also, we got the BP money, and a lot of that has all gone into that fund that's really fueled a huge investment in our coastal projects throughout the last decade, more than that, 2 decades. This is a similar, at least analogous thing. The dollars are not anywhere similar. I mean, we've gotten hundreds of millions of dollars a year per year through the oil and gas revenues. We're talking 15, 16 million at the top is kind of what the estimates have been so far on the solar. Again, that's if we get the solar going and if Congress passes it. Some people see this, I think, as a way to help bait, if that's the right word, or incentivize the federal government to help consider, passing this sharing thing. If we show that we're doing it this way, our congressional delegation, Steve Scalise and Bill Cassidy, both have legislation. They're working with other interests along the Atlantic coast, even in the Great Lakes area, to try and do some things to get this passed. So it just seems like it's a very good thing to do to try and help with the passage of that federal legislation. And the other thing is it's consistent with where we've been, in the past in terms of coastal money. The last thing I'll say, yeah, it's another dedication. We don't like doing that. But, there are some things that are really, truly important. And I think a lot of people in our state feel like the coast is one of those where we trust people to use those kind of monies, but we want to mandate it too.
Okay, thank you. And Daniel, the Pelican Institute has taken a position in opposition to this one, and I'm assuming it might be about the dedication aspect. So can you walk us through your position?
Absolutely. I'll pick up where Barry left off, which is we have as we have all been, a number of us on this call certainly have been working on constitutional reform. And one component of that is trying to get more flexibility within the state budget so that I agree with Barry. I think this is a priority that most voters would say is important to fund and spend money on, which just for us leads to the conclusion that we need to empower the legislature to make those decisions and to represent the priorities of their constituents. So as we're working to try to undedicate resources across the state. We certainly understand the motivation behind it, but have argued we shouldn't certainly add to the problem. At worst, we should hold steady.
Okay, Jan, take it away. Where is Invest in Louisiana on this one?
Well, so we haven't taken a formal position, but I expect that we will. We're generally in support of this concept for the reasons that Barry said. There's nothing more important in South Louisiana. South Louisiana is the heart of Louisiana's economy. It's where a lot of our economic activity is generated, and if we don't protect the coast, we really threaten lives and livelihoods, and we don't have nearly enough resources to meet the needs as it is. This isn't going to solve that problem, not even close. It's really in terms of state budget numbers and relative to the need, it's a tiny, it's a drip in the ocean. But I think most voters would agree with the idea that revenue generated from offshore power generation is best spent protecting the coast and just making sure and sending that signal to Congress is a good idea, so that nobody on Capitol Hill gets the idea that if we send this money to Louisiana, they're going to use it to build a bridge in Shreveport or fund a pet project in somewhere else. So this seems like a good idea. And in general, I think we do dedicate probably too much things in our Constitution, but this is one that makes sense.
Okay, and I guess this is the place that I'll just add a little bit of context, which is the master plan for the coast is billions and billions of dollars. We have not funded even a sliver of that yet, really. And the source of revenue that we have, that is the primary source that we're using to fund coastal projects at this point, is from the BP oil spill. And that money is set to run out in 2031. So that's the rest of the story. And now I throw it to Stephen to go on to amendment number 1 on the December 7th ballot.
While we're pulling it out, let me say real quick, we do a guide to amendments every year, and I wish all our webinars were sponsored, but particularly I want to make sure that PAR thanks the Alton and John Franks Foundation and the Colin C. DeBall Private Foundation for helping support the work that we do to put out the guide that a lot of people really found helpful. So I want to make sure, now that we're getting to the thick of it and people can see, oh, wow, yeah, we really need help from everyone that's experts on this. So I wanted to thank them. But let's go ahead and go on to the December elections. All right. Generally, this has to do with the Judiciary Commission. The Judiciary Commission is the group that investigates judges for misconduct and then recommends disciplinary action to the Supreme Court for them to take. The proposed change would do a couple of things. The two major ones would be to expand the number of people on the Judiciary Commission. It would add an additional 5, 2 from the House, 2 from the Senate, and 1 from the governor. They could be basically of any background. Most of the Judiciary Commission members have to be appointed by a judge, or have to be a judge, or have to be a lawyer, or have to not be a lawyer. So they could really be of any background. Also, the Supreme Court could essentially ask the Judiciary Commission to initiate an investigation. So that is one of those are the major changes in terms of what we're seeing proposed.
Okay, so right, so currently the Supreme Court cannot ask the or take any disciplinary action against a judge without the Judiciary Commission starting that process. So this would tweak that, obviously. Daniel, I know the Pelican Institute hasn't necessarily taken an official position, but you said you were sort of leaning favorably to this. So I'll let you explain why that is.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, this is a little out of our core wheelhouse, so we did not work on it during the legislative session, nor have we taken a formal position. But you know, this came up, this issue, as we were discussing has come up a number of times in sort of the context of broader judicial reform, in the context of the constitutional reform. This has come up. That's why it has to be addressed through an amendment, because it already is in the Constitution. You know, I think the concern this is trying to address is sort of the fox guarding the hen house issue, and that the makeup of the review commission now really hamstrings the Supreme Court, which is charged by the Constitution with regulating the practice of law in Louisiana. So this would allow the Supreme Court to have more influence during that process. And you know, there are some things probably if we were drafting this, we might have done differently, but the public deserves more transparency. The public deserves a faster resolution to a number of these, and I know some have written on the need perhaps for more resources in the process of investigation. Certainly understand that, but changing the makeup of this and giving the Supreme Court more authority at the front end, we think is a positive change that that ought to be considered. And you know, we'll have a theme in this discussion of complex amendments that have a lot of parts to them. This is one of those, unfortunately. But again, we see this as progress toward the right answers.
I think the word you're looking for is arcane.
That's good.
Some very dense and in the weeds amendments that the poor voters have to work through. So Barry, I know Cable has taken the opposite position and y'all are opposed to this. I guess you and Daniel are going to be duking it out the whole time today or something.
Nah.
Can you explain why Cable is in opposition to this?
Well, first of all, I would agree with Daniel. Definitely. I mean, there's a problem that legislators in particular are trying to address with transparency, the fact that this body or this entity that actually is in charge of the investigations, you know, of misconduct of judges. And it's not just the Judicial Commission itself, but it's kind of the broader process of even after actions are taken. Sometimes you can't figure out, you know, okay, what is the action? What's it for? What was the offense? You know, why did this person get sanctioned? There was a lot of secrecy around it. A couple of years ago, the legislature or the Supreme Court did take some actions to make it more transparent. And we think that was a very positive thing. May not be the end of the road for where we need to be, but it was a step in the right direction. I know they're still quibbling over it. I guess I'd say two things. Number one, I'm not sure how this particular amendment really addresses the transparency thing, except perhaps that it opens the door for the legislature to write those rules, which I'm not sure that's the best idea. Number two, I'm not sure how it speeds up the process because they get 300 or so complaints a year with about 5 people working on these things. And that seems to be a big part of the problem with all the judges that we have in that. I don't see how that speeds that up. But the real thing, I think, is that it seems like, at least this year, maybe, it seems like every time we have a problem with a board or commission, we decide to add some more political appointees. So that's what we chose to do here on this. So we added 5 more political appointees, 2 from the House, 2 from the Senate, 1 from the governor. And I'm not sure how that's going to solve that problem either. I mean, the way that the commission is made up now is you've got appointees from judges that are judges, appointees that are attorneys, and appointees that are citizens that can't be lawyers or attorneys.
And it's 3-3-3.
3-3-3, right. 3, that's an even number. You've got 9 of them. And, you know, that seems to be a very well thought out intent to create balance in terms of what we are. Throwing 5 political appointees who can be anybody down the street, can be a politician, could be, you know, whomever, just seems like that doesn't seem like the great solution that we want to put in the Constitution. And maybe we, you know, Daniel's right. I think there's been a lot of talk about this during the constitutional rewrite. We think we ought to save this for that final constitutional rewrite.
And with that, I'll kick it to Jan, who was opposed to a constitutional rewrite.
Surely this is a problem that the legislature can solve in 2 weeks while they're also rewriting the tax code. I don't see what could possibly go wrong. No, full confession, I had not thought much at all about the Judicial Commission until this landed on the ballot. It was not something that our organization tracked at all during the legislative session. But I'm inclined to say absolutely transparency is a good idea. But to Barry's point, I don't know how adding 5 political appointees, having the legislature and governor get involved in this makes it any better. I think if there's a way to add transparency, that's good. It certainly seems that this commission needs more staff. You know, having 5 full-time lawyers and 1 investigator to handle 300 to 500 complaints a year seems absolutely inadequate. And so, you know, again, this is not an official position of Invest in Louisiana at all, but I think it's certainly judges need more oversight. And they're an important part of, they're a whole branch of government. And unless you're in court or a lawyer, you often probably don't think about it. But sometimes people get elected who maybe aren't up to the task, and we need to have a system to check on that. But I don't know if this is the answer.
What about one of the other piece of it isn't just the expansion of the commission, but also giving the Supreme Court more authority to actually direct an investigation. And I think the idea there is that the justices get blamed for when judges misbehave or when there are misconduct allegations, but they don't really have control over determining how to investigate or who to investigate. Is that a winning argument with you, Jan?
Yeah, no, that's I think certainly, you know, to Daniel's point is right. And again, we don't have a position on this, but yes, if the Supreme Court is in charge of the judiciary, then certainly they probably should have a little more flexibility and authority to go in and investigate cases. But what they really need is the, you know, the boots on the ground who can do those thorough investigations, because, you know, it doesn't, you know, voters elect these judges, and voters have the ability to unelect judges that don't do the job or do the job in an unethical fashion. So I think what we really need is a mechanism for the public to be able to judge these judges better than we do right now, because most of us never set foot in a courtroom. And when we show up at the ballot box, we really have no idea who these people are and how they're doing their jobs. Lawyers tend to know, but most of us don't. I'm not a lawyer.
We do have a question about having members appointed by political officers, and how would that allow politics to steer cases? So I want to go back to both Barry and Daniel, but Barry, I know this was a big concern that you had. So how do you think that having new appointees from the legislature and the governor would allow the tone of the commission to change and suddenly allow politics to be more influential in steering cases?
Well, I would say it could go either way. It depends on who the appointees are. But I guess my point is what we have now with the system is at least a fairly, well-defined kind of attempted balance in terms of what we're doing. And when we get to the third group of folks, the 3 citizen members, it's very clear in the way that it's worded now, they cannot be political officials. We say specifically, we don't want politicians to be part of that citizen group. With this part, we don't say that. We don't have any qualifications, any, regulation requirements or anything like that. So I mean, the legislature is a political body. The governor is a political, person, and I'm not talking about the governor, but a governor. I mean, that's the nature of things. Look at appointments. They tend to be political. Not to say that every single one is, but there's certainly a lot of room for more political stuff to get in there. And I would prefer, well, first of all, I would prefer not to see this part of it at all. But it seems like if we're going to put some qualifications for some of those folks in there, that the idea of them not being politicians and political figures is one that we would want to add to that.
And Daniel, I'll give you an opportunity on this. Is this something that is concerning? And we have another question along the same lines of, aren't there political appointees now? And do political appointees somehow allow a breakdown between the separation of powers?
No, I see this as mostly positive. I understand Barry's concerns, and I think those are reasonable, reasonable concerns to raise. But what happens in the current structure is that this becomes very insular to that community of the judiciary, and it is a good thing. And we talk about inserting politics in it. We elect judges in this state. There are already politics in the judiciary, whether we like it or not. And so I don't know that adding appointees from the legislature and the governor really add more politics to it. I think what it does do is allow for some individuals who may be able to better represent concerns that the public has about conduct of judges. So I certainly can understand the concerns, and I know this is a big question and a debate that's happening right now in terms of appointments across the board. I don't see this as a particularly troubling addition of quote politics into the mix, and I do think it adds more voices. And I'll also just point out this also authorizes the Supreme Court to set deadlines for these investigations. So I hear Barry's and Jan's concerns, and don't necessarily disagree that more resources would be valuable there. But this does add some urgency and priority to things when the Supreme Court's able to set deadlines.
Okay, well, thank y'all for making the Judiciary Commission far more interesting than I think it might otherwise seem to people.
No, I'm so happy
Stephen,
we
back
have
to
like
you.
diverse voices talking about, from different perspectives. It makes it a lot more interesting. Also, I think makes it a lot more educational for voters to hear the different perspectives. So why don't we move on to the first of a pair of two bills dealing with how budget bills get passed. All right, the first of these two, and they are conceptually linked, they are not legally linked, is that it would require 48 hours before the legislature can pass a budget bill. They need 48 hours to review the amendments and also have a summary document. So the bill path or the amendments are put on, changes are made. You have to wait 48 hours after the amendments and for a summary document, so the legislature knows actually what is happening. And I'll let Melinda kind of talk maybe a little bit about the origin of what happened.
Well, so I'll say this is, just to be clear, this is for like the final vote, the final passage when the bill appropriating money is going to go to the governor. This is not each individual step along the way, but this is when you get to the very end of the process. And this obviously stems from 2023. God, we've had so many sessions. I had to think for a second to remember which one.
Just last year.
It was the regular session of last year, and there was quite an amount of chaos in the final half hour to 45 minutes of session when they were rushing to pass about $52 billion in budget bills in a flurry of votes before the deadline, before the session had to end. And so that's what sort of prompted this. Daniel, I believe you are in support of this one. So I will start with you on if you can explain why y'all are supportive.
Yeah, absolutely. This we all lived through the 2023 budget, but this is not new. This is a tactic regularly used in the legislature. We've seen it year after year, not every year, which proves they can get the budget done early if they so choose. But used to put things and amendments in conference at the last minute, and then have just a few minutes to read a bill or attempt to skim through a bill that, as you said, is appropriating $52 billion of taxpayer money. This is something that deserves far more scrutiny, far more transparency to the public. And for groups like ours who actually spend time looking at these, it's nearly impossible to get the conference committee report and make a whole lot of sense about it. The way the Senate handles amendments, the way the House handles amendments, and the way those come together. So the challenge is you don't really. I mean, it's the old "we got to pass it to see what's in it" mindset, and that just happens far too often. And so what this amendment does, Representative Bacala has been championing this for some time, is it forces. Now, look, there's a criticism of this. It says, why does this belong in the Constitution? And I'm, as we'll talk about on a couple other of these, I'm skeptical of things that get added to the Constitution. The fact of the matter is, our perspective is this rises to a level of importance. This has been a House rule and a Senate rule, I believe, for a very long time, and they don't live by it. And if we're going to hold lawmakers accountable, if we're going to be advocating that they have more flexibility and more authority to appropriate taxpayer dollars where there are priorities, we need to make sure this is clear and public and has a lot of trust from their colleagues and from voters and taxpayers. So we believe this is an important rule, a valuable one, a valuable complement to the next one we'll discuss, and will lead to and change the incentive so that we remove this ability to sort of play games at the end. So they'll find other ways to play games, I'm sure, but this at least gives some time and transparency to try to sort it out.
Yeah, I think there'll always be games. Jan, I think the argument against it is generally that, legislators are grown-ups and they should be able to do this without needing like guidance in the Constitution about how to do this. And they already have House and Senate rules that require this. They just don't follow them. So do you have a position on this for Invest in Louisiana, or what are your thoughts on this amendment?
Look, we don't have a formal position on this, and Melinda, I agree with what you said. I mean, this is taking a sledgehammer to kill a fly, and I don't want to say that it's and I don't think this is something that really belongs in the Constitution. Look, you and I both covered the Capitol as reporters. We both track the budget very closely in our current roles, and we're familiar with the frustration that comes with seeing a complicated conference committee report, and you have to figure out what's in it very quickly. And but I don't know if it always would affect the vote. And again, the legislature has the power to do this now, and we have the power to hold them accountable with our votes. And I think. Look, nobody would really defend the chaos of the end of the 2023 session, but you didn't hear these calls in prior years. And I think, legislators elect leaders, and the job of those leaders is, they decide who they have faith in to manage this budget process, because 144 people can't all read, even if you give them 2 days or 2 weeks, most of them aren't going to read every detail of those reports. They trust, they elect people they trust to be their voices in those rooms. And the best leaders, I'm thinking of John Alario in the Senate, really understood what all the members needed and was a good voice for their entire membership, Republicans and Democrats in that room. That process didn't work in 2023. I don't know if you need to solve that through constitutional fiat.
Okay. I mean, the budget bills that we're talking about are billions of dollars. So I think people have trouble understanding conference committee reports generally, but to anybody who's watching who's never seen a conference committee report, it literally is a report that says, we accept this amendment, we don't accept this amendment, with no explanation of what those amendments do. So you have about, reams of paper and 15 different sets of amendments that you're trying to piece together to figure out how they're spending your money. Barry, I believe Cable has taken a position in opposition to this one. Can you explain why?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how Daniel and I got so crosswise on things. Jan must be loving this, but
we'll have a boxing ring later.
No, I mean, obviously it's a good idea. It's already part of the legislative rule. We've had it for 30 years in one form or another. It's a very good idea to do this. The problem is, do we want to put it in the Constitution, as Jan said? I mean, that's a very big step. One of the things that came up during the discussion was the very, the sort of midway step of why don't we do it instead in statute? You could do the same kind of thing in statute. Yeah, the legislature can change it, but you could raise the bar. So right now it's, the legislature, it's in the rule. They can just waive the rule with a majority vote, keep going and do whatever. Raise the bar, raise it to 2/3, raise it to 3/4. Do something of that nature that makes it a very difficult thing to do. But what if they get the conference committee report or the reports that they're looking for late? What if instead of 48 hours, it's 47 hours? What does that do? I mean, what can the legislature do at that time? Do they have to adjourn? It just seems like it would be better to take the incremental step of trying to do something statutorily, which a lot of the committee members felt kind of positive about during some of the debate. And in fact, it looked like it was going to go that way, and then things kind of skidded off in another direction, and he ended up passing it, I think, to Representative Bacala's surprise, got out of one of those committees. But we would prefer the more incremental approach. Think it makes more sense. And finally, again, we're talking about the Constitution. We're talking about not cluttering things up. Anybody that reads this, looks at it, it looks like a rule. It does not look like a constitutional, level piece of foundational government.
Since when has that ever stopped us?
Can
Well,
I
that's
just
what's kept y'all in business.
Let's move on to the companion amendment that is not legally tied to it, but is like spiritually tied to it.
Exactly. They both have the same author. He was dealing with the same frustrations. Would you support an amendment essentially that it can extend the regular session for 6 days, and you have to do it in 2-day increments. So you can do 2 days, 2 days, 2 days, to only pass budget bills. So during this extended part, you can only pass budget bills. It's so that they would give the lawmakers more time to deal with any things that they've not been able to deal with because of the various issues we've already talked about.
Okay, and so the idea with this one is if they're going to need that 48-hour time period to look through the final package of amendments and get the supporting documentation that they want that gives them more detail, that might put them in a time crunch towards the very end of the legislative session. And so this would give them the ability only for these bills that are appropriating money to extend the session, so that instead, what would happen normally without this is if they don't finish a budget by the time the regular session must end, they would have to call a special session, and then they have to restart the whole process all over again, where they start budget bills from scratch, go through committee debate, all those things. This would give them the ability to avoid doing that and just extend the session by 2-day increments. So I think we have a milestone moment where Barry and Daniel may be on the same side of an issue here. I think y'all are both in support of this. So let me start with Barry.
Is that a typo, Melinda?
What?
Is that a typo? Did we read it wrong?
Yeah, moment, but I'm gonna let them have it. So Barry, why don't you start by explaining why you don't dislike Daniel this time?
Well, I've always liked Daniel. No, actually, as I mentioned before, we thought the other one was a really good idea, just not for the Constitution. For this one, it makes sense for the Constitution. The Constitution tells you when the legislative session, every session starts, regular session, and when it ends. And you can't change that in any kind of way. When you get into those situations, which we're just talking about, that are really, at the end of the very rope, everything else is kind of taken care of, these last things, if you can't resolve it, to have a special session, which we did do a few years ago, where the governor called a 12-day special session after the legislature could not come to terms with some budget cuts. They didn't meet for 12 days, but they met for 9. And that, as you mentioned, they had to go through that whole process of going, introducing the bills, going through all that. This way they can pick up where they left off, do it in 2-day increments. The maximum is 6, which is less than the 9 they took the last time. And it just makes sense to give them that flexibility to do that. It saves money to the taxpayers. It really does not make the legislature look as bad as they did that time when they did it before. And it's a reasonable response to the issue that is a very real one that we have that we're dealing with. So we think it's a good idea.
Daniel, fill us in. Do you agree with Barry on everything?
I do. I agree with Barry on that. I in honor of the events of this weekend, I just want to just note, I hope that we're entering our fiscal responsibility era here in the Louisiana legislature. And all too often, going back even to our last debate, they just shake off those rules and don't abide by them. Sorry, I'm done.
Daniel, that was a very swift move. Nice.
But this is right. This is a thoughtful, reasonable way to make sure we don't have to live through some of that again. I actually think it is an excellent companion, certainly to the last one we discussed, but it works as well, even if this one is on its own. This is a reasonable thing. As Barry notes, this is something the Constitution clearly deals with. And the Constitution exists to explain the constraints of government, to clarify individual rights, and this falls squarely into setting the rules of the debate, setting the rules of the game.
Okay, Jan, is it going to be a kumbaya moment for all of the organizations, or do you have differing thoughts? Because I know
Jan, I also want to know, what would John Alario do?
In keeping with the Taylor Swift theme, I think it's a love story.
All right.
No, look, this, and I want to be clear, I think, going back to the previous amendment, having 48 hours to consider conference committee reports is an absolutely good idea, and the legislature should strive to do that as much as possible. But if there comes a time when there's just too many questions and too many unanswered questions, this gives them the ability to say, all right, you want to send me a conference committee report with 30 minutes to go in the session, we're going to vote that down because we don't trust what you did in our name. And then again, you don't have to start the clock over. So I think it seems like something that could save money, save time, save a lot of aggravation, and hopefully give them all an incentive. I think by the time we get to the end of the session, most people want to get out of that building as quickly as possible. And so there's always going to be an incentive to finish their work on time. But yes, there are billions of dollars at stake. Generally, when we're talking about conference committee reports, we're not talking about the big pieces. We're not talking about, funding Medicaid or LSU. It's projects in specific districts. It's usually not the big ticket items that they've been talking about for months, but those smaller pieces, those amendments are critically important to some members and some communities. And again, I think what we saw in 2023, the last day of a 4-year term, was a real breakdown in trust. And so this gives a mechanism for when you have a situation where they should be able to restart the clock, or not have to restart the clock, but be able to take a couple extra days. And I agree with Daniel. That's the kind of thing that does belong in the Constitution, and because the Constitution can be a little too restrictive when it comes to deadlines focus the mind, but sometimes you just need a little extra time.
Well, I feel like we should mark this remarkable moment when everybody agreed, but this is when I'm required, since we work for PAR, and we present both sides to the issue. I am going to explain what the argument against has been from other people's perspectives, which is that legislators are grown-ups. They should have enough time to handle their work. They know what the deadline is for the regular session, and they should prioritize the spending of billions of dollars in a way that gives them enough time to actually digest what they're doing and pass it in the timeline that they currently have without adding extra days that cost money for the state. So that is the opposing perspective for that one, for folks who are interested. And we'll move on to the favorite amendment for everyone in terms of complexity and difficulty to understand and explain, which is Amendment 4 on the December ballot. Stephen?
You got to see Melinda smile there. Yeah, I will tell you, and this is not a judgment of the amendment and how good or bad it is and how better it will make Louisiana or worse. This is just from our perspective of having to write this up. This is one of the toughest since I've been at PAR. To actually sort of be able to translate to people. But that doesn't mean it's bad or good, but just this is a tough one. So right now, this is about tax sales, not sale or this is about, yeah, man, I'm already messing it up. That's how bad it is. So now, not sales taxes. So if you don't pay your taxes, or you have some other, you owe the government some money, then they can put your property up for sale, often known as a sheriff's sale, and then people can buy that property. Now, when they buy that property, there's still 3 years where the owner can come back and essentially pay with penalties and interest and get the property back. So you own it, but you don't have clean ownership of it until after those 3 years or even more. So that's the current system. And there's a lot more details in there that I'm leaving out because you really don't necessarily buy the whole property. You buy some percentage of it. It gets complicated. The new version is essentially you don't buy the property, you buy a lien. So you someone doesn't pay their debt, then you can buy a lien. It says, okay, look, it works like a mortgage. So like a bank might have a mortgage. Essentially, they've loaned you money that you now owe them back. But you still own your own house. But if you don't pay it, and this person has a lien, then they can force you to go into a foreclosure. And at that point, the person that has the lien would get the money that's owed plus penalties and interest, but they would never get full ownership of the house. So you essentially, the government would only get that money that is owed to the government. It wouldn't get a windfall if the sale was actually much higher than the current version. And there's a Supreme Court court case dealing with that in terms of our process may or may not be afoul of that ruling, but that has not been finally declared to affect the Louisiana courts and system at this point. So I know it's clear as mud, but essentially what some of the proponents are saying is that this is actually a much cleaner process, but it could also possibly be a longer process, which some people are concerned about on the other side. That is about as best I can do in the short period of time available. But but please ask questions if at all. And Melinda?
This is one of those moments where I will just remind everybody that part says we should have a much more streamlined constitution, and many of these details would be better left to statute than these kinds of amendments that voters have to sift through. I feel like we should apologize on behalf of the legislature and the revenue department to all voters who have to figure out how to vote on this. But that being said, there are some court rulings that play into this, and there are legal questions about whether Louisiana has violated some recent court rulings with the current process we have. So that's clearly what prompted the amendment to go to the ballot. And since Barry has done such a fabulous job in explaining this to other folks, I'm going to start with him because I believe that Cable supports this one, and he might be able to explain to us why.
Yeah, well, actually, Stephen did a great job of explaining because it's impossible to really understand. But yeah, I mean, that's the bottom line. We have these tax sales when people don't pay the taxes on their property. And the way that it works is that, and it's really investors that come in and start getting involved in these properties. It's not everyday people. It's investors that do this in a very, professional, methodical type of way. And they're from all over the country. They do this stuff. They look for these types of things. But in Louisiana, which is different from a lot of states, when you come to these property sales, you are buying a piece of that property in the current system that we have, where in most states, you're buying kind of that lien, that mortgage that Stephen was talking about. So what has happened is the courts have said there could be a problem with that, because if you're actually buying a piece of somebody's property, you've got to make sure that there is proper notice, through a tax sale. If you're getting rid of it through a tax sale, there has to be a proper notice to everybody that's an owner. And we tend to think, well, this guy's living in the house, he's the owner. Well, guess what? We learned after Katrina, there can be many owners to properties where there were not successions done, the legal work wasn't done, and the title people, the people who are in charge of figuring out who is the actual owner, it's a nightmare for them. So this is to try and fix that, number one. Number two, to deal with a court ruling that said all these things, because if you're not telling everybody who's a potential owner that their property is going up for a tax sale, it could be nullified. So that's the problem they're trying to deal with. It hasn't really happened so much yet, but it's trying to head that thing off. What should be added, I think, to the discussion to complicate it more is that what the constitutional amendment does is take most of the language. There's a lot of language in the Constitution about tax sales. It takes most of it out. And then it says the legislature will determine how to do tax sales, but it has to be through this lien process, not the other. And then the legislature went ahead and passed legislation describing that lien process. So we have a law passed by the legislature now that describes what that new process will be with this lien system when or if this constitutional amendment passes. So we're doing a couple of things. We're cleaning up the Constitution, number one, largely. We can talk more about what we're not cleaning up in a minute. But two, if we pass it, we're also putting in place legislation that the legislature has already passed and puts in a dramatically new system than what we have right now. So is it good or bad? You know, it depends if you're an investor in this stuff. Some people don't think there are going to be enough incentives for people to invest. Remember, the real goal of this is for the local governments to get their tax revenue from delinquent taxpayers. Others say that will work itself out. But I think the key thing is, whether you like the system that they came up with or not, what we are doing in this amendment is we're taking most all of the language about tax sales out of the Constitution, giving it to the legislature. They did what we wanted them to do. They wrote a law saying what the new process will be. If we don't like that process, or they figure out in the next few years it doesn't work, people don't like it, they can change it. Don't have to come back mercifully to us voters and do it through a constitutional amendment. The legislature can fix it. So for that reason, we feel like, it could have been cleaner in some ways, but it's a step forward. And if this doesn't work, you can still fix it. I know that was really enlightening.
Oh, no, I thought that was a great explanation.
That was great. I was thinking we're going to just snippet that part out and be like, go listen to Barry.
I think the bitter part of me who had to write about this wants to point out that the companion bill is more than 80 pages. So that's fun. I also think we should note that if this amendment passes, it would not take effect until January 1st of 2026. So there is sort of a phase in time to switch processes. Jan, I'm going to put you on the hot seat about this one. Do you have thoughts about it at all? Are you interested in the change in process? Do you think it moves it to a streamlined process or just changes it for no valid reason?
Well, just like the Judiciary Commission, this was not something that I had given a lot of thought to until this landed on the ballot. I appreciate, Melinda, the work that you've done to explain this, and Barry, the work that you did. And really, I read the amendment. I have not read the 80 pages, but I think it's, from our perspective, you want a process that protects property owners. We have, and as Barry explained in his analysis, you have a lot of property homes that have been passed down from generations. We learned this after Katrina, and there should be a real, we should be very careful before we take somebody's home because they were unable to pay their taxes. Because we have a lot of people in the state who struggle to make ends meet from week to week. So a lot of times when I hear that Louisiana does things differently than almost every other state, I'm kind of generally skeptical. And so I don't hold myself out as an expert at all on this process. And again, I tip my hat to those of you who've really spent a lot more time on this than us, but this seems like a good idea. And I do feel sorry for the voters who have to. I mean, I understand why we have to go to the Constitution. It's in the Constitution. So if you want to change it, you have to do it through the Constitution. But I suspect that the December ballot is not going to be a huge turnout election, and I sympathize with anybody who has to go and try to figure this out, because unless you're really involved in this process, this is probably something most people haven't given any thought to.
Okay, and that leaves us with Daniel. I know you said that Pelican has not taken an official position, but it seems like you're leaning in the support category, sort of like Jan.
Yeah, I think we probably end up similar to Jan. I'd like to point out, I think Jan just endorsed a constitutional convention there and a streamlining of the Constitution.
No.
We can review the tape later.
That's right. That's right. In all seriousness, yeah, there are two things that everyone probably can wrap their head around. One is there are cases moving through the courts and some recent Supreme Court decisions that suggest change is necessary. And two, a lot of this doesn't belong in the Constitution. I think Barry, Cable's and Parr's write-ups on these are really good. I encourage people to read them. You might need to pour a finger of bourbon or a glass of wine while you do to make it a little easier to get through. But they've done a great job explaining them. Whether this is the right answer, the wrong answer, this isn't in our particular wheelhouse either. But moving things out of the Constitution and the statute, simplifying hopefully the process and giving the legislature the ability to fix it when we're in the face of a court decision, all seem like a pretty good idea.
We have a couple questions from folks about this amendment, which I'm glad people are interested. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to answer this one, but does anyone know how many local homeowners are permanently losing property to the current system that we have, the tax sale system? Is that a big number of any kind?
I haven't seen any numbers. I would guess, it's hard to put a number to, but I would guess, given the interest that there was from the investor community, it must be a significant amount of activity that people are very interested because there was opposition to this, and it was really, again, from the investor kind of community side of it. So I would think, given that there would be a significant number of these properties that are out there in this process, that it caught their attention, and that's why they came to the table, from some of them from out of state.
And I guess this is the point where I'll at least explain slightly. Barry did some of this for me, the explanation of what the argument against is, but essentially some folks in the investor side of things seems to think that the tax lien auction system and the way it's constructed and has longer timelines could discourage property investors from wanting to actually participate in the system, which could make it tougher for government to collect on the delinquent property tax debt. That's one of the arguments. There are others that this still puts too much complex language in the Constitution that shouldn't be there. And of course, that a lot of the lawsuits and court rulings have already cleaned up some of our system, and that this is unnecessary. So those are kind of the arguments, some of the arguments against. There are many more as well. And we do have one more question, which is, I'm not sure if anybody's going to be equipped to answer this one, but somebody asking about parishes using Civic Source to outsource the sale of their delinquent properties, and asking whether the government has a system in place that they can migrate to the new system. So does anybody know if in the discussion of this, there's already been an idea of what system they could move to outsource this? I obviously there's a year, if this were to pass, there's a year for the state and parishes to migrate to a new system. So they do have some time built in to adapt to this. But does anybody know if they've already figured out how to outsource this if they switch systems?
Any land title folks, attorneys in the audience that want to chime in, that'd be great too. Because I don't know we have that level of detail.
I'm not familiar, but as long as we're on an earlier theme, there is built into this process we have now, sort of this, kind of Taylor Swift ticket kind of process where it's a lot of this stuff is automated, by the way these things work. And I don't know if that's part of that question. I do know there were some concerns that were brought up in the debate about that kind of automated process that, it's like, Wall Street, when certain things happen, these things just trigger, and it's the same deal with this or trying to get a Taylor Swift ticket. I don't know if that's part of what the issue is, but I know there were some concerns and brought up during some of the debate about that, but I didn't get any notion that resolved that one way or the other, quite honestly.
And I guess I would say, just this is an assumption, and we know how assumptions can go, but other states use the tax lien auction process. So clearly other states have found a way to do this, because that is apparently what a majority of states use. Right. So clearly they found a way to make this work. So you have to assume that there's some outsourcing available that other states have used. We do have one more question about this specific topic. Apparently tax sales are of interest, or at least confusing to people. So this watcher is asking, is the change going to make it easier for absentee landlords to deprive local governments of revenue to provide services? This looks like an affordable housing question, essentially, that absentee landlords, I know there are issues, particularly in the New Orleans area, about landlords and not taking care of their property. I don't know if that folds into delinquent property taxes necessarily.
I don't know the answer to that. I do know there is something in there dealing with blighted properties that has an expedited time frame. I think it's I can't
18
remember
months?
the 18 months.
18 months.
Yeah, and there's definitely something in there about that. So it does try to take into account those type of properties, but I'm not sure if it's just absentee land, if that's the same thing the person's talking about.
Okay. Anybody else on that one?
I got nothing.
Okay, well, I think that brings us through all 5 of these very complicated, difficult to understand amendments that voters get to decide this fall.
Do we want to come back and we had one on the CPRA?
Sure, if you want to take it, we were running out of
Wait,
time, so.
Since we have just a little bit of time, someone asked about the CPR amendment, and someone who's in support of it would speak on the dangers of a shrinking coastline.
Barry?
John?
Barry.
There's so much to say.
Well, can you do it in 60 seconds?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's it's the part of the heartbeat of our state, our coastline. I mean, there's just so much to be said about that. It's our fisheries, it's our, it's everything, and it's our culture, it's our people. It's such a huge priority, for our state. I think there's pretty widespread support that this is, a priority that is such a losing words here, but such a large, issue that we're facing as a state, that anything we can do to try and address this. And we've got a lot more to do besides this amendment, but this is just one piece of that puzzle.
All right,
I
great.
kind of want to give
Yeah.
Daniel the ability to respond since he's in the opposition.
Daniel, would you tell us why the coast isn't important?
That's right. No, look, I certainly understand that, and I would agree in principle with Barry. I think a lot of people would, that's something voters have been pretty clear about. The means by which we do it and the ways to approach this question, I think, vary pretty broadly. But certainly, I think there's broad consensus that this is an important topic.
All right, thank you very much. That's a great way to end. I thought there was a wonderful discussion, lots of disagreement, but also done very civilly with a great attitude. I think it's a great model. There's a reason why these people are a gang of regulars. It's always great to hear from them. Hopefully this was enlightening for y'all. This will be on our YouTube channel, so when your relatives ask, hey, how should I vote? Instead of explaining it, you can just go point them to there. Or any of the guides that any of these organizations do, including ours. Thank y'all very much. We might be back next month, maybe on talking about tax reform and see what came out of the special session. Just depends on timing. If not, we will have some other equally interesting topic for everyone to talk about. Thank y'all so much, and all of you enjoy your Taylor Swift event.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks,
Thanks.
Melinda.
All right, y'all.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you.